Good afternoon and welcome to our first event of the academic year. It's the first. We'll have more in September, but we wanted to to have a chance to promote and launch this book today before the semester really started. This is our first event of the academic year at the HRC in the series Meet VCU Authors. My name is Cristina Stanciu. I'm a professor of English and the director of the Humanities Research Center here at VCU. And today I'm joined by my co-editor of this book, Gary. I don't know if you want to unmute yourself and say hello.
Hello, I'm Gary Totten. Really happy to have worked on this book with Cristina and these fine folks here. I'm the Vice Provost for Faculty Affairs and Professor of English at the University of Nevada, Las Vegas. Welcome.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. As many of you know, our Meet VCU Author Series invites members of the Richmond community, as well as colleagues and students from VCU and other universities to meet VCU authors as they talk about their publications and answer questions about their work. And as we know, it's also a time for celebration as publications take many years to complete. Our virtual events follow a more or less similar format. Today, we'll briefly introduce our volume and introduce our 4 guest speakers who will have about 7 minutes, and then we'll have time for questions from the audience. And as you know the drill, please post your questions as they come to you in the Q&A function or in the chat. Today, I'm delighted to introduce a volume that I've been very honored to work on as a co-editor with Gary, whom you've just met. And before we dive in, to offer a very brief introduction, I promise we would like to thank our 17 authors listed, I think, on the next slide. There we go. And also, we'd like to thank the University of Illinois Press for their assistance in bringing this volume to life. And as you may know, it's very expensive to produce books now. We were just talking about the beautiful art cover of our book, which you can see there. So we'd like to thank our respective institutions, Virginia Commonwealth University and University of Nevada, Las Vegas, and specifically our deans of liberal arts, humanities, and sciences for supporting this book financially with book subventions and other. So thank you so much for making this possible. Now, I will start the very brief introduction to this work, and then Gary will continue and introduce our 4 speakers. So here we go. In a volume that radically changed how we teach race, called Race in the College Classroom, Pedagogy and Politics, published in 2002, Bonnie Tu Smith and Maureen Reddy lamented that a significant portion of university and college faculty members managed to ignore race in their teaching. 2 decades later, in the aftermath of a global pandemic that has accentuated manifold disparities along racial lines, racial protests throughout the United States fighting anti-Black and anti-Asian racism, and in the context of ongoing settler colonial extraction and continued dispossession and disavowal of Indigenous sovereignty, when Gary and I first met to discuss the idea for this volume, we asked, can we still ignore race and ethnicity in our teaching? I think we know the answer. We dedicate this volume, as you will see, to our students and our teachers, and start with this epigraph from Bell Hooks' 1994 Teaching to Transgress. Quote, "The classroom remains the most radical space of possibility in the academy," end quote. Teaching the histories and representations of marginalized communities in an ongoing settler colonial context certainly poses challenges to instructors and students alike. The study of slavery, genocide, and marginalization is often uncomfortable and takes time and a willingness to unlearn. It is never easy to talk about race and racism in the college classroom or any classroom, but so necessary, especially now. The recent backlash against critical race theory, CRT, and the study of race in conservative-led states in the United States reveals a deeper need, for institutional integration of meaningful discussions about race and racism in various fields. How do we continue to train future teachers, regardless of political regimes dictating what we can or can no longer teach? This volume, as some of you know, and thank you so much for being here. I see a lot of our MELIS colleagues. Originates, as you may imagine, as you may remember, in a MELIS special issue I had the honor of co-editing with Anastasia Lin in 2017 called Pedagogy in Anxious Times, as well as in many conversations, panels, and roundtables over the years at national conferences, including the National MELIS Conference. And the book has emerged from it was really a labor of love, as Gary will confirm, but really emerged from a productive contemporary social and political moment of rethinking and relearning the history of race and racism nationally, and from examining the implications of this rethinking from our respective fields in our institutional context and the positions we inhabit in the academy. At the same time, we hope it offers teachers and campus administrators insights into how a systematic examination of race in the multi-ethnic literature classroom can provide the basis for broader similar initiatives across departments and programs. And I'm going to turn it over to Gary.
Yes, thank you, Cristina. So several chapters in this volume rethink the place of U.S. multi-ethnic literature in university and community college curricula as demographic shifts across the United States point to growing numbers of BIPOC students and increased student interest in the study of marginalized histories and communities at the same time that the professoriate continues to remain overwhelmingly white. A word on the terminology in the text. With the term multi-ethnic literature, we refer to literary works by Latinx, Indigenous, Native American, African American, Asian American, Pacific Islander, and ethnically specific Euro-American authors. By focusing on the teaching of race in such a classroom, this volume provides pedagogical strategies to approach and incorporate issues and concepts such as structural racism, anti-racist action, white privilege, racial literacy, empathy, critical race theory, and others in the teaching of multi-ethnic texts. And now just a bit about the structure of the text. We have organized the book into 4 parts: racial literacies, race, history, and pedagogy, racial justice and anti-racism, and race, racism, empathy, and hope. Because of its importance to the goals of the volume and of our teaching, we start with literacy, specifically racial literacy, and chapters on how to develop students' racial literacies in the multi-ethnic literature classroom by Jennifer Ho, Joanne L. Fried, Yadira Gamez, and Yannicka Snyder, and Lauren Gantz. The chapters in the second part focus on history, emphasizing how the development of racial literacy requires instructors to engage in rigorous historicization of race and racism with work by Crystal Perez, Kristen Brown, Norel Martinez, and Luis Cortez. Historical knowledge reminds us of the work of social and racial justice movements in the past, and our current historical moment emphasizes the crucial need for ongoing anti-racist work, a topic that some of the authors take up in the third part of this collection, with chapters by Emily Rudder, Sarah Minslow, Ariel Santos, and Kevin Payan. The chapters in the final part of the volume demonstrate how the frequently challenging discussions of race and racism in multi-ethnic literature classrooms allow instructors and students to develop empathy and exercise hope, even in the context of persistent systemic racism and racialized violence. The authors in this section include Shermaine Jones, Marilyn Edelstein, Nancy H. Carranza, and Naomi Edwards. An afterword by Martha Cutter reflects on how foregrounding race and racism in the multi-ethnic classroom via transformative pedagogies allows students and teachers to grow in racial literacy and to become potential agents of social change. So I will now introduce our 4 speakers. We will first hear from Jennifer Ho, Director of the Center for Humanities and the Arts and Professor of Ethnic Studies at the University of Colorado Boulder. A past president of the Association for Asian American Studies, Jennifer is the editor of 4 essay collections and the author of 3 scholarly monographs and many essays and articles. Jennifer's chapter is titled The Necessity of Racial Literacy. Following Jennifer, Luis Cortez will speak about the missing Latinx students in the selective university. Luis is an assistant professor of cultural studies and American literature of the U.S. at Texas A&M University Kingsville, where he also serves as the interim freshman-sophomore English coordinator. His scholarship focuses on the U.S.-Mexico border, ethnic enclaves, and prison detention centers of the United States, and he has a number of essays published and in progress. Next, we will hear from Kevin Payan, assistant professor of American literature, race, and ethnic studies at Penn State Harrisburg, whose chapter is titled Not Another Anti-Racist Reading List, Afro-Pessimism, Auto Theory, and the Limits of Anti-Racism. Kevin's work has appeared or is forthcoming in venues such as Popular Music and Society, Women's Studies, the New Centennial Review, and Early American Literature. Our final speaker is Charmaine Jones, Associate Professor of African American Literature in the English Department at Virginia Commonwealth University, who will speak about confronting the spectacle of Black death in the Black Lives Matter era classroom. Charmaine's research is concerned with Blackness, the politics of mourning, and anti-racist pedagogy. She is the author of a number of essays and is currently working on a book project titled Breathtaking Pedagogy, Urgent Teaching Practices in a Time of Precarious Breath. So we'll begin with Jennifer and turn it over to you, Jennifer.
Thank you very much, Gary. And my sincere thanks to both Gary and Cristina for their expert editorial shepherding and herding of cats, because that's what it's like when you edit such a incredible volume as this. I also, Cristina, you reminded me, my very first publication as a graduate student was in Race in the Classroom that Reddy and Two Smith edited. So I feel like this is kind of a full circle moment for me to have begun my academic career by writing about race in the classroom and getting to contribute an essay about racial literacy, which is something I've been thinking about for decades. So I actually know Kevin from when he was a graduate student at UNC Chapel Hill, and that's actually when I was thinking about racial literacy and just the need for racial literacy really everywhere. But I'm focusing on the multi-ethnic classroom, obviously, for this volume, because it is, I think, where I honed my understanding about the necessity of racial literacy in the multi-ethnic classroom. But I would kind of argue that in all classroom spaces, we need to have racial literacy, because particularly, and by the way, if we haven't noticed, there is a major presidential election happening in the United States in which race, racism, and intersectional oppression are focusing really acutely. And I know that one of the things that gets said, particularly if you're living in a red state, that talking about race and racism is somehow political. And I suppose it is true that it is political, just not necessarily electorally political in the way that people want to say it. So the three things I really want to emphasize today about my essay are, number one, that when we talk about racial literacy, I think it's really important to talk about structure. That when we think about literacy, right, the ways in which we have math literacy or financial literacy or literacy around reading and writing in various languages, there are structures that are in place. And I mean structures within the discipline of financial literacy, math literacy, the learning of reading and writing, right? There's a grammar, if you will. And I think similarly, there's a grammar, there's a vocabulary, there are rules in talking about racial literacy. And when I say rules, I think people sometimes get a little bit bristly because they somehow want to think that, well, race and racism and these terms are interchangeable. And to a certain degree, that's true, right? That race and racism has a kind of flexibility in how we've understood and how we've talked about it through the centuries. But in other ways, it's not true. And what I mean is, when I talk about race and racism in the classroom, I'm clear with my students that there are certain things that are not up for debate. So we can talk about varying definitions of ethnicity, or we can talk about, just other things that I think are maybe fluid in the way we think about race and racism. But it is not up for debate that race and racism are real. So that's what I mean, right? That there are certain things that I think we have to take as a grounding, like these are the agreed upon principles and rules. Just like if you're teaching chemistry, H2O is the chemical symbol for water. Similarly, white supremacy, I take as a given in my classroom, and I teach as a given in my classroom, that white supremacy and settler colonialism are two ideologies that have undergirded the history of the United States. And we can debate about the acuteness of white supremacy, but we cannot debate in my classroom that white supremacy is not real. And I can talk to my students about how concepts like white supremacy and settler colonialism evolved, but I will not let my students argue that white supremacy is not real. So that's partly what I mean by there are certain rules. And I want to say this, I recognize that I am in a blue state, in an ethnic studies department, and I teach through an ethnic studies lens, which means I'm also getting certain students in my classroom now. I was 17 years at UNC Chapel Hill. Well, that was not a given. So there are different strategies one has to use based on context. And that's the next thing I want to talk about is context. So I understand that as much as the things on my syllabus are things to be read, so is my body. And that in fact, in being an Asian American woman in the classroom means that I am oftentimes one of the first Asian American faculty that my students have encountered. And certainly that's true of being in the humanities. And that there's an expectation that they have about me as an Asian American woman teaching them Asian American content. And so the other thing that I really try and emphasize to my students is that while I appreciate that they understand that I have a lived experience as an Asian American woman in the classroom, I'm able to teach this content because of my scholarly expertise, and that the works that we are reading are not ethnographic experiences. They are works that have been crafted. Even if they're memoirs, they're still narratives that involve craft and aesthetic dimensions. And I think that's a really important thing to emphasize to our students, that what they are reading are narratives that have been crafted. And I think that's especially true if we are reading non-white authors, because so often we assume non-white authors just write about what they know, and that they don't have years of their own expertise and honing of craft when they are creating narratives. And then the third thing that I just want to end on is I think what's really important in teaching racial literacy in the multi-ethnic classroom is building trust and building a sense of community. So my students don't have to like me, but they can't think I don't like them. Because if they think I don't like them, or that I'm looking down on them, or somehow I have any negative opinion of them, they're not going to succeed in the classroom, that they're just going to tune out. And so one of the exercises I do on day one of every class I've ever taught is to assign an introductory letter. So on the back of my syllabus, I write an introductory letter to my students, and it lets them know a few things about me that they just can't find on my website. So they learn that I really love to cook. They learn that I golf, which really shocks people. They find out that I have a corgi, just kind of things like that. Sometimes, depending on what's going on in my life, I may share even more personal details. So the semester after I was recovering from breast cancer surgery and treatment, I shared that in my letter. And I was a little bit hesitant about sharing such a vulnerable personal detail, but I also recognized that I was going to have some challenges that semester because I had been recovering from breast cancer treatment. And what I found in making myself vulnerable in that letter, and let me also say, I am, of course, this really depends on your personality, right? And I have the kind of personality where I'm very open with my students, and to a certain degree, kind of understanding that I'm sharing this vulnerability not to place a burden on them, but to kind of open myself up as a human being to them. And what I found in doing that is they wrote back these incredible letters sharing their own cancer experiences, that they had relatives who also had various forms of cancer, that they themselves had had cancer scares or other kind of health scares. And it created this kind of very rich empathy in the classroom that I hadn't quite expected. And what that really helped me see is that by creating an introductory letter for my students and inviting them to also share parts of themselves with me, if they wanted to, that it was, again, this kind of first level of trust, because I knew I was going to be asking them to get really uncomfortable with certain topics. And that I needed them to trust me, that I wasn't going to try and make them feel stupid, that I wasn't going to try and call them racist or ignorant, right? Because students are very afraid of being called these things by their professor or by their peers. And so the other thing that I try and do is create exercises in the classroom to really build trust with each other and with me, and then to scaffold the assignment so that by the midpoint of the semester, we can tackle much more subjects that are maybe harder. Like, I don't know that I go hard with them on the first day about white supremacy, but definitely by the midpoint of the semester, we are having real conversations about what that means in the literature we're reading. So I'm going to stop there. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Jennifer. We're going to make a quick transition to Luis. And while we prepared the screen, I just wanted to give a shout out to 3 other of the authors who are in the audience. We have over 60 audience members. Just wanted to welcome Kristen Brown, Marilyn Edelstein, Nancy Carranza, also authors in this volume, and also our friends from Mellus, Tracy Floriani and Leah Milne. I'm sure there are others. I apologize for not acknowledging everyone. I just wanted to give a shout out to our authors. Luis, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Cristina and Gary and everyone else who's here. I just wanted to highlight and begin my talk by noting that yesterday, MIT released data that showed that in the time span of 1 year since affirmative action has been removed in that state, MIT's students of color population has drastically dropped. In fact, I think they noted that they're down 10 percentage points in 1 year, which is kind of the realization of our worst nightmares, right? And just to kind of highlight the importance of this upcoming election and the kind of politics. That being said, I would like to say a few words about my chapter, which is titled Our Absence, the Missing Latinx Students in the Selective University. I will try to provide some context at the end of my share about where these ideas came from, specifically in my own lived experience. But in my chapter, I propose that a dialectical framework, which means recognizing that which is absent and simultaneously present, as a teaching strategy will reveal for educators and students the intimate links between those present and those excluded through structural racism and classism. When applied to our classroom space, a pedagogical foundation in the dialectic exposes that some bodies are present while others are conspicuously made absent. This absence exists as a form of haunting in our classrooms. And again, I'd like to remind you about those 10% students of color that are missing from MIT now as a form of absence, a very real, maybe even tangible idea that you can sort of keep in mind. Of course, when I say haunting and ghostly absence, I'm using Avery Gordon's formulation, and I'm using them for their dialectical characteristics as that which appears to not be there, but is often a seething presence, and I'm quoting Gordon here, acting on and often melding with taken for granted realities, to note how the absence of Latinx people from elite institutions of higher education is often left unquestioned or assumed to be the logical result of some merit-based system. When applied to our classroom space, the dialectical model reveals that certain bodies are missing from our student demographics, in this case specifically Black and Latinx students, as I focus in my article. Yet while some bodies might be missing, there are nonetheless intimate historical connections rooted in imperialist practices between those that are absent and those that are present, such as the formation of myths concerning problem minorities and model minorities, which are triangulated against each other by and for the benefit of dominant hegemonic culture or groups. Now, notably, the White House Initiative on Educational Excellence for Hispanics has stated that Hispanic serving institutions represent approximately 8% of all colleges and universities, but they enroll more than 50% of all Latina and Latino college students. This statistic demonstrates that HSIs have a high concentration of Latinx students, but these campuses account for a minuscule percentage of the total higher academic learning space. Most Latinx students are concentrated in only 8% of the total college and university campuses in the United States educational system, while remaining quantifiably absent from the larger majority. So fundamentally, my work inquires if Latinx students are disproportionately made absent from the classroom spaces at higher institutions, where are they? How have they come to be centralized in HSIs, but underrepresented or completely absent from other universities? Now, the dialectical model is a recognition of that which is purportedly absent, in this case, the ghostly haunting produced by an unaccounted for history of colonialism and imperialism that remains in our classroom spaces, grading policies, institutions of higher education. In my chapter, I share a few examples and exercises in knowledge production that all instructors can use, whether the instructors are Latinx or not, for students, whether they're Latinx or not, that is predicated on presence and absence. In particular, in my chapter, I focus in on a translation exercise that I go into detail where the authoritative text is moved to the margins, and those who have been historically relegated to the margins or the peripheries are brought into the center. And I can say more if people are interested in asking in the Q&A portion. The exercise focuses on the language and experiences of those who have historically been rendered the target of those colonialist mechanisms of oppression and dispossession. This exercise accounts for the absence of structural, monetary, political, and legal support for students of color or students of lower socioeconomic status, and uses that absence as an opportunity for knowledge production emergent from the historically marginalized in our classrooms. And if Gary would do me the great favor of opening up the slides that I've shared with him. So I just wanted to quickly give a little bit of context of where these ideas are coming from that I'm talking about here today. So I went to an institution that some of you might be familiar with. It's called the University of California at San Diego. In fact, a couple of the contributors in this volume are also from that university. But while I was there, in my first year of being at the University of California, only 3% of the student body self-identified as Latina or Latino. And if you disaggregate the data differently, you might get to 13% if you include those who self-identified as Mexican American. But in any case, that experience led me to ask the question, even as a student, where are the other students that look like me or have similar experiences to me? And of course, in quick succession, that same first year that I was at UCSD, we had, let's call them race protests, or maybe some other people might call them race riots on campus, where there was Gary, if you could go to the next slide, please. There was an event called the Compton Cookout that happened on campus, where a student organization invited people to dress up as and imitate and parody another ethnic group, in particular, Black people. So they were asked to come dressed, and you'll see this on the next slide. They were asked in the invitation to come dressed, you know, as ghetto queens and as gangsters. And it's really, I know that the image of the text is poor quality, but you know, this is something you can look up on your own. You'll see that it's quite horrifying, even by standards back then in the early 2000s, which Gary, if you'd go to the next slide, there was a strong student response to these events, which, you know, led to the Black Student Union and allies forming coalitions on campus to sort of make our demands and our voice heard. For instance, the fact that there weren't many people of color, like I said, 3% identified as Latino at the time. And I'm forgetting the number for African Americans, but it was probably less than that. And Gary, if you go to the next slide, please. There was backlash against the student protests. So all of a sudden on campus, you started to see nooses hung around campus as a visceral reminder to know your place to students on campus of color. You would see them. This is an image of the noose that was found in Geisel Library. Inside in the book stacks, there were nooses found right outside of Geisel Library, hanging from a tree that is sort of an art installation known as the Silent Tree, and so forth. So this is a contentious period that kind of led to the ideas that ultimately culminate in this chapter. Where are the students of color, in particular the Latinx students from highly selective institutions? And finally, in the last slide, Gary, if you could please. This gives you the sort of ethnic breakdown from 2009 that I was just mentioning. 3% identified as Latino, 10% as Mexican American. So if you want to aggregate the data and put them together, sure, we had 13% at the time. I will note that today, in the year 2024, that number has climbed to 20%. And the category has changed from Latino and Mexican American to a combined category of Latino and Chicano. And I go over this in my chapter, that there might be fiscal monetary interest in the institution to do such a thing, not necessarily because the university altruistically decided it was time to increase student representation. And in fact, I talk about in the chapter how these designations, emerging HSI or HSI, are often linked to admission rates, not graduation rates, which causes a different problem that I explore in my chapter. So with that, I thank you all so much for the opportunity to share, and looking forward to answering some questions in the Q&A. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Luis. And I think we need some technical assistance from Ronnie, so we can just maintain one slide. I think, Gary, if you go to the display settings button on the top of your screen, yeah, let's see what happens there. Oh, not much. Ronnie, feel welcome to chime in as Kevin prepares.
Should I get started?
Yes, let's get started and then we'll
Okay.
figure this out. Sorry about that.
Yeah. Thank you, Cristina and Gary, for providing the opportunity for writing this chapter and discussing it today, and also for both of your support throughout the entire process thus far. So my chapter is premised upon a case study of when I assigned an auto theory essay for an Intro to AFAM Studies course that I taught a few years ago. I've done different iterations of the assignment since then, so that's something I could talk about maybe later on. But in the brief time that I have today, I'll discuss the impetus for this assignment, this auto theory assignment, and some of the results that some student examples very briefly. So the impetus for this assignment was this, I think, well-known phenomenon of creating and sharing anti-racist reading lists in the aftermaths of public instances or specters of racial violence. So such lists are obviously meant to promote awareness about the perennial problem of racism in American society, I think particularly to a lay audience. And then, in turn, the implied goal is that readers will undergo some fundamental change in themselves and become, in short, anti-racist. But notably, and I think crucially, Black scholars such as Lauren Jackson and some others I mentioned in the chapter have criticized this phenomenon of anti-racist reading lists as a form of virtue signaling, perversely, I think we could say, spurred by the repetitious cycle of racial violence. So there is this again, I think perverse is a word we can use, this relationship between instances of these certain events of racial violence that happens to catch cameras and happens to come before us via social media or television. And then this almost virtue signaling response of we should read these books, right? And so one of my suggestions in this chapter is that the genre of auto theory proffers a pedagogical opportunity for students to reckon with the histories and legacies of racial violence, in particular for my instances in AFAM Studies course, but I imagine it could be applied for other courses, beyond the low stakes of an anti-racist reading list. And maybe if we're being honest with ourselves, we could even call it a syllabus too, right? Like just saying that, hey, here are some books to read and hopefully it makes a difference. Auto theory, in short, can be defined as a hybrid genre characterized by the encounter between the two halves of the term itself, right? Autobiography and theory. And what scholars have extolled so far about auto theory is its perceived radical politics and transgressive interdisciplinarity. So on one hand, auto theory expresses this conception of intersubjectivity that is supposedly, it critiques the self-possessive individualism of autobiography. If we think about the history of autobiography as a genre, a la like Ben Franklin or something. And then the universal subject of theory, a la Kant, we could say. And now on the other hand, auto theory has been extolled for challenging the disciplinary boundaries, both within academia itself, right? So the different fields within academia, and then also between academia and society at large. So a lot of examples of auto theory are not just books by scholars, publishing within university presses. They're also this these works of more, I guess, popular works that are targeted or geared towards a lay audience. But so far, there hasn't really been much scholarship at all about the potential of auto theory within the classroom. So I've been doing personal research on auto theory as I guess as a genre, but then I guess in conversation with this idea of anti-racist reading list, it kind of spurred me to think about ways that auto theory can maybe have a pedagogical role to play within the classroom. So for my chapter in particular, I focus on the auto theory of Black studies scholars such as Saidiya Hartman in her book, Lose Your Mother, and how it offers a critical and pedagogical alternative to the perverse logic of anti-racist reading lists. So in this work, if you haven't read it, it's fairly well known. Hartman weaves together her account of visiting a slave route in Ghana, scholarship on the history of the transatlantic slave trade, and meditations on her own experiences of slavery's violent legacy of estrangement. And it's interesting because oftentimes students, when you ask them about like slavery and what that means to them as a system or as a history, oftentimes their mind goes to like these popular representations, like even like 12 Years a Slave or Django Unchained or something. And so what's interesting at first about the way Hartman talks about slavery from an auto-theoretical perspective is that it's more than just about bodily harm, right? And it's also even more just about it being a system of labor. It's about the legacies of estrangement that she feels from the Middle Passage. So through this genre of auto theory, Hartman joins together analyses of the history of slavery and her own personal experiences to trouble conventional notions of historical progress. Now, that's another key thing that Black studies scholars really hone on, and is particularly recently through auto theory, right? This idea that students come to class with a chronological view of history, right? Something happens in the past and is done for, right? And ideas like Hartman's idea of the afterlife of slavery, or Cristina Sharp, in the wake, right? These ideas of the wake and the afterlife kind of trouble students' notions of thinking about the history of, in this instance, slavery, right, in this afterlife. So as a model for thinking about auto theory in this FM studies course I taught, Hartman's Lose Your Mother challenged students to think about their own lives in conjunction with all the texts we read so far. So not just like thinking about this syllabi or syllabus of texts, almost like functioning as an anti-racist reading list, like, hey, come to class and just read these books, right? Hopefully you leave a changed person. In my first attempt at crafting this assignment, and this was a final assignment of the semester, so it was meant to be a cumulative assignment, I asked students to compose an essay in which they close read a personal experience or memory in relationship to a literary or critical text we had read. So they had free reign to choose any text we had read the entire semester. Also, I was interested in auto theory for its interdisciplinarity, like I mentioned before, because none of the students in the class were majoring in a humanities discipline. So it's a lot of like, like STEM majors or business and so forth. So I was interested in thinking like maybe auto theory could give them an opportunity to think about the role of the humanities at large, right? Besides it just being some class I have to take. Some of the guidelines I established were focused on maintaining an ethical stance towards the issues and worldviews covered throughout the semester. So for example, students could opt out of writing about anything traumatic or triggering. Obviously, they didn't have to do that. And we also discussed the importance of centering or substituting their own identities when employing Black critical theory, right, to examine their personal experiences, particularly for non-Black students, right? So lots of workshopping for this assignment. I think oftentimes our first reaction is to sort of just like maybe uncritically apply what this Black author or critic has said and just kind of like apply it to our lives. So lots of workshopping to try to maintain a proper ethical stance. So I'll finish here looking at very briefly 4 different examples of, so these are some of the, and again, this is the first time I did, so I just did a very conventional essay just to see what would happen. So one African-American student focused on Hartman's Lose Your Mother to talk about how she came to terms with the existential crisis of her African and American identities. She ultimately related a unique bond to her Cameroonian heritage that she maintained despite the violent legacy of the Middle Passage. So hers was a really great example of how students don't also just like unwittingly follow everything that perhaps a scholar has written about, right? Because Hartman's Lose Your Mother, if you've read the book, it's a little bit more dire, or you could say pessimistic about the legacy of the Middle Passage. So this student took Hartman's analysis and sort of like framed it for her own experiences. Similarly, another student focused on Douglas's What to the Slave is the 4th of July to write about his own experiences as an African-American man growing up in New Jersey. And while he challenged the hypocrisy of ideals of equality and freedom, he also reaffirmed a commitment to Douglas's legacy of political activism. Another student who identified herself as the daughter of Middle Eastern parents focused on Du Bois's essay, The Conservation of Races, which was surprising because it's a very difficult essay. But she used that essay to discuss the limitations of her own previous views about the, quote, respective sufferings of different groups of people, right? The way that this logic of race has still informed the racial demarcation of humanity that we all still live through, right? And she previously had this view that, like, I guess her own experiences of Islamophobia sort of like gave her an odd, almost like passive aggressive response to listening to other forms of racial violence. And then finally, I'll conclude by discussing the example of a white male student who focused on Stokely Carmichael's essay, What We Want. And I think this is an interesting case too, because oftentimes, especially maybe not for AFAM studies courses, but for other courses, depending on your location, the majority of your class may be, you know, visibly white students, right, rather than students of color. So after this student described his upbringing within a working class background, he relates his painful experience arguing with his family members about the social realities of racial violence, particularly following the murder of George Floyd. And then, so there was this sense of hopelessness that pervaded his essay, but he concluded with a commitment to recognize and speak up, and this I'm quoting him, when he sees injustice being committed against others. And he sort of like reflected for me, Cristina Sharp has this essay called Lose Your Kin, right? And that is like, if you want to be very radical, that's sometimes the stakes of being committed to anti-racism, right? This like willingness to almost lose your kin, right? To really push yourself to take seriously what you read about within the classroom. And in future iterations of this assignment, I've incorporated more of a multimedia format, similar to Cristina Sharp's ordinary notes, almost like this archival method of bringing together personal memoir and criticism and film analysis. But that's something I could talk about later on in Q&A if it comes up.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Kevin. Now Ronnie will share Charmaine's screen. And I also wanted to give a shout out, since Charmaine is our colleague here at VCU. Shout out to all our VCU colleagues who have stopped by to say hello, to support us. I see Michael Hall, Rachel Gavlin, Chris Shin, Grace Gibson, Hillary, and so many others. So thank you for being here. And Charmaine, looking forward to your talk.
Thank you so much. And I just want to say thank you again to Gary and to Cristina for this amazing project. And it's been delightful to also listen to the other panelists and see how seamlessly everything is gelling together. And so here we go. So confronting the spectacle of Black death in the Black Lives Matter era classroom. And Ronnie, you can go to the next slide. Cristina Sharp has been hailed a number of times already, but I love this quote, and it is something that also animates and my own research and thinking. I've been thinking about what it takes in the midst of the singularity, the virulent anti-Blackness everywhere and always remotivated to keep breath in the Black body. As we are daily bombarded with images and recordings of brutalized Black bodies, unarmed Black men and women dying at the hands of police in real time, we must confront the ways that we engage with the mundane nature of Black trauma. My essay speaks to concerns and commitments at the heart of this timely volume in addressing pedagogical strategies and ethical interventions for urgent but also difficult conversations about race in the multi-ethnic classroom. I share teaching strategies that I use to engage in honest discourse on these sensitive subjects, including the teaching tool of leaning into discomfort and the reading practice of handling warmly Black trauma and grief. And for the sake of time, I'll only focus on the leaning into discomfort, but I'm happy to talk about handling warmly during discussion. And next slide, please. Wrestling with issues of race in the multi-ethnic classroom requires vulnerability and a willingness to embrace discomfort. I encourage my students to lean into discomfort in the classroom by challenging them to put their own discomfort with the subjects we engage under analysis. I invite them to ponder questions such as the following. What is at the root of my discomfort with this conversation or subject? How does talking about it make me feel? How does my identity impact my perspective on this issue? What alternative ways of viewing this matter might I consider? For white students, leaning into discomfort demands an intentional decentering of whiteness, and perhaps especially white guilt, which is often a convenient distraction in discussions of race and racism. These conversations can also be uncomfortable for students of color, who often feel the burden to teach, call out, or clarify problematic statements. I relieve my students of color of this emotional and pedagogical labor by asserting that I'm the instructor in the classroom, and while all voices are equally valued and instructive, the burden for teaching is mine. Some of the most transformative moments in my classroom have been when we question the ways we become complicit in the voyeuristic circulation of Black death through our consumption and recirculation of these images and recordings, even in the name of promoting awareness and activism. Returning to the ethical imperatives of Elizabeth Alexander's groundbreaking essay, Can You Be Black and Look at This? Reading the Rodney King videos, in conjunction with contemporary works like Claudia Rankine's Citizen and American Lyric, and we can have the next slide, invites us to consider important ethical concerns of our current moment. And I want to talk about this specific concept that Cristina Sharp forwards in her In the Wake, called when she thinks about different strategies of wake work, called Black redaction, which is a particular thing that I see Rankine doing in Citizen and American Lyrics. So Rankine employs Black redaction, a modality of wake work, or quote, ethical viewing and reading practice that counters the repetition of violence associated with gratuitous circulation. And I want to specifically take a look at the next slide, where a number of you may be very familiar with this. It was a heavily circulated image called a public lynching, but the ways that Rankine reproduces it here is really interesting. So by redacting the hanging bodies of the young Black men, thereby turning the eye of the viewer away from the spectacle of lynching onto the crowd of onlookers, pointing to an empty space in the sky, this forces us to confront the spectators, the viewers, and ponder the seemingly harmless nature of the gathering and the absence of horror, shock, and sympathy in the eyes of the crowd. One wonders at their casual glances and mundane fascination. Removing the lynched bodies from the image forces us to confront the spectators, implicate them in the scene, and hold them accountable for watching. It also makes us aware of our own watching and the ways that we consume these images. This awareness requires that we question what occupies our own gaze and how we relate to these images. So in my classroom, I invite my students to ponder these questions and to consider the ways that Black redaction may offer us a way to simultaneously remember without participating in reproducing violence. And I'm just going to ask you, Ronnie, to quickly flip through a couple of the next images. I don't talk about these in the essay, but they are an extension of the concept of Black redaction. And Sean Leonardo, who does these really interesting art installations where, and if you can go back to the slide where he kind of explains, yeah. So he says, for these drawings, I take some of the most widely disseminated images of police violence, both recent and historical, and make choices that I think will slow down our looking. I wish to literally create space in these images so that we can sit with them differently, even in the hurt. I'm intentionally removing or isolating details in order to point to the absence of lives lost and to critical information that would otherwise go overlooked. Ultimately, I want to turn people's looking into bearing witness. And this is something that I talk to my students about a lot, about the difference between spectatorship and bearing witness, which requires a certain responsibility and a level of engagement that just watching does not require us to do. And again, I can expound on that a bit more. I'm going to run through the rest of it for the sake of time so we have time for questions. But my experience is exploring literature and race in the multi-ethnic classroom affirms that literature helps us to better understand the concerns of our moment and to imagine and shape a more equitable future. Some students of color shared that this class and a number of the classes I've taught has been the first time that they feel seen, the first time they recognize themselves and their experiences in course material. And that is an incredibly powerful, transforming, and healing experience. And for many of my white students, developing a critical vocabulary and acknowledging rather than ignoring the ways that race informs all of our lives empowers them as well. And because I always want to center my students, we can flip to the last slide. And this was a culminating reflection post that a Black woman student observed. And she stated, "It is hard to know when to bear witness to these stories and when to disengage to protect yourself mentally and emotionally. I look forward to the day, if it ever comes, when you get stories from Black authors and they're about Black joys and not just the oppressive sorrows, because that would be a thing of the past." So this radical hope for a future is reflected in the literature we engage, the lectures that I offer, and the lessons we learn together as we tackle the challenges of our present moment. Intentional, critical, and engaged pedagogy that handles warmly the traumas and experiences of Black people affirms their worth and beauty, and that empowers all students to be able to speak critically about the ways that race impacts our everyday lives, creates a space of hope and possibility in the classroom and beyond. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Charmaine. We are still waiting for questions from the audience, but that's okay. We have some questions prepared for you. So I'm going to turn it over to Gary to get us started.
Yeah, thanks everyone. That was terrific. So this is a question that we thought of related to Jennifer, but I think it might relate to everyone. So I'll pose it to Jennifer, and other folks can chime in if they want to. So as we head into the fall semester, of course, we are entering a historic and likely contentious presidential election season. And what role do you see racial literacy or any of the other, I guess, strategies that you all have talked about playing in our efforts to help our students navigate the political discourse, excuse me, this political discourse that will attend this election? And how do we responsibly create space in our classrooms, do you think, for these kinds of discussions?
Thanks, Gary. I'm happy to answer this question and then also hear what my fellow panelists have to say. So I've only ever taught at public universities that have really stringent rules about the things that you can and can't say related to elections. And even if I didn't, I would still say the same thing to my students ahead of a presidential election, which is essentially that I am not trying to tell them how to vote. It's not my role in the classroom. And they are free to vote however they want. And actually, my job in the classroom is to teach them critical thinking skills. And as such, we may talk about current events that are going on, and that I'm doing this again, not to, and I want to recognize that it is really tricky, especially this year, to try and do that, because really one of the best examples to talk about would be what happened at the National Black Journalists Association, right? That we need to deconstruct that, right? As a society, just what was going on with having 3 Black professional women journalists in a room full of predominantly, I would imagine, Black journalists. Maybe 99% are probably Black identified, right, of the people that were in that room who were attending the conference, including students. And then what it meant for a white male presidential candidate who has had a history of making anti-Black remarks in particular to somehow question the racial identity of his opponent. And so, you know, I would think that would be such a great thing to deconstruct. I also recognize that doing that is really difficult, depending on where you are situated in the classroom, and that there's likely, even with whatever caveat you want to give, there's likely no way to use that as an example without students feeling like you have taken a political stance, right? Because there is no ethical way and logical way to parse that without saying that the man on that stage, the white man on that stage, trafficked in anti-Black racism. So probably the best thing to do is to not use that as an example, even though it's you know, ripe for the telling. But I think we can certainly talk about, for example, multiraciality, which is not well understood. that somehow, and yet it shouldn't be too hard to understand, right? That people can be more than one thing. So if we understand that people can be more than one thing, then we should understand that people also can be more than one race. And that actually this has been true throughout human existence, not just recently in the United States. And I think that is really crucial for us as educators to emphasize.
Thank you, Jennifer. Anyone else to this first question? Luis?
If no one minds, I'd like to go. As Jennifer was stating at the beginning of her share, I think context really matters. And I live in Texas. I teach in Texas. It doesn't get any redder than here. So it's a fine line you have to toe. You have to really have good strategies for engaging these conversations. And what I like to do, I take a lead from Lisa Lowe. In fact, in my article, I use that same kind of language, intimate points of contact or intimate links between groups that are ethnically different or racially different, separated by time and space, to show that, in fact, our experiences are intimately connected to one another. And that's how I think in my teaching, I like to show students that this isn't a white guilt conversation at all. In fact, whiteness is a category that expands and contracts and shapes and changes as well with time and context. So we begin the conversation that way by helping students who might be reluctant to engage in these conversations understand that actually they are at the center of these conversations as well, right? Because at one point, it was just as dangerous and detrimental to your health to be Irish in the US as it was to be Black. Or there were racial covenants created or in place in the law books for certain cities that precluded Jewish people from owning land there as well. So by beginning this conversation, by showing that actually this is a topic that concerns all of us, whether you happen to be Black, brown, or whatever you identify as, it's something that we need to address together. So that kind of helps people, not necessarily, I'm not interested in changing their political views or having them vote like me, but I'd like to see them have a more nuanced conversation about how race continues to be a haunting presence in our classroom, even if race purports itself not to be in our curriculum, right? I think Dr. Shermaine said something about absence as well. So I think that's at the heart of a lot of our work here.
Absolutely. Thank you, Luis, for that very thoughtful answer. And I'm going to try to combine two questions from the audience with one of our questions. And Mimi Winnick asked about, your very important concept of handling warmly, right? And the practice of handling warmly. So Gary and I also wanted to ask you to talk a little bit more about this, right? The decentering empathy, and you suggest, and also attending to the feelings and experiences of Black subjects. So what would you consider to be the most challenging aspects of this strategy, and also its rewards? And Sydney Wardrett, in one of our audience members, also asks a question related to our previous question, which is, at the height of this upcoming presidential election, in which ways do you hope to protect not only students of color, but also yourself in the classroom? Sydney, thank you for this very generous question.
Thank you so much for these questions. So, in thinking through empathy, and we often talk about that and the significance and the importance and the work that can do. But Cydia Hartman, who's another one who's been signaled a couple of times here in our discussion, talks about the limits of that and trying to put yourself in another person's position, right? It's still centering the self. And a lot of the times when I came up with the concept, I was borrowing from for colored girls, and Tazaki Shange says at this point, let her be born and handled warmly. And I think about the practice of within Black culture of literally warming your hands, as you prepare to hold the baby. So, it's about thinking about the feeling of the subject and not your own processing your own feeling towards. And I specifically have another essay where I talk about it in relationship to Black women's grief, Black mothers grieving publicly, and the fact that a lot of the times we are expecting their grief to do labor, to raise the consciousness of a nation. We just saw, even with the image that I featured of Emmett Till's mother, and how groundbreaking her decision to have an open casket was in terms of raising awareness, but there wasn't necessarily the attention to her personal emotional grief, her actual labor. It was meant to be done in honor of, raising consciousness and moving forward a movement. So when we politicize Black women, specifically emotional labor, right, we don't actually think about the cost to them. And so I look at certain literary works like Frances Ellen Harper's, she has an amazing poem called The Slave Mother, where she just cries and refuses to be silenced, despite the fact that it is disturbing the peace, right? So what does it mean for her at that moment to privilege her tears, even if they don't have a particular political outcome for others? And so a part of it is about decentering these expectations around the productivity of Black grief and Black emotions, and allowing them to simply be. And that's a part of that attentiveness that I discussed with Handling Warmly. I can't remember the second question, but I'm sure someone else might want to speak to it.
Wonderful. That's okay. Thank you so much. And we'd like to end with a question for Kevin. Kevin, I see you've already answered in the chat, but not everyone has access to this question, so or your answer. So the question is, can you give a few more specific examples of how the idea of anti-racism work fails to push students to interrogate racism in our society in comparison to auto theory? This
Sure.
is
Yeah, I typed the answer in case I couldn't get to it, because I do have to run the class soon. But what I wrote was that in the chapter particularly, I guess I'm getting at the idea of how these anti-racist reading lists really do conscript the idea of anti-racism to this like form of virtue signaling. And even sometimes perhaps in the classroom, if it's like there's the usual thing of sometimes you just want to diversify your syllabi, so you just insert authors of color, right? And as if that does the work itself. And so part of what I put in the answer was in my answer is that something about I guess I'm thinking about in the chapter how auto theory as a genre in the classroom might be a way to really push students beyond just passively reading these texts, and really like start reckoning with the ideas and the themes in a more personal way.